Hello dear students, this is Dr. Shabana Begum, Associate Professor from the Department of Zoology, Maharani Science College for Women, Bangalore, presenting a lecture on the histological structure of mammalian ovary pertaining to BSc Zoology 4th semester under the paper entitled Comparative Anatomy, Human Anatomy, Cell Biology and Histology. Students, in the previous session, I elaborated on the histological details of the adrenal gland, which is an endocrine gland. Fine. I'm sure you have followed the same, and today let me explain the histological structure of mammalian ovary, that is the female reproductive organ. The content of this particular session would be to know the introduction of this reproductive organ, ovary, then histology of ovary, Ovarian follicle, corpus luteum. And the learning objective would be, after the completion of the lesson, the students will be able to learn the histological details of the ovary and also understand the structure and function of Ovarian follicle and corpus luteum. So, small introduction about the ovaries, which are paired female reproductive organs. These are the primary reproductive organs of a female, and these are flanked the uterus on each side, and these are shaped like almonds located in the lateral pelvic wall region. Fine. So you can say each ovary is held in place within the peritoneal cavity by several ligaments. The ovarian ligament anchors the ovary medially to the uterus, and the mesovarium suspends it in between. So both the suspensory ligament and the mesovarium are part of the broad ligament, which is a peritoneal fold that tends over the uterus and supports the uterine tube. Right? So the fibrous ovarian ligaments are enclosed within the broad ligament. The ovaries are served by the ovarian arteries, which are branches of the abdominal aorta, and by the ovarian branch of the uterine arteries. Fine. So the external surface of an ovary is surrounded by a fibrous tunica albuginea, and it is in turn covered over externally by a layer of cuboidal epithelial cells called the germinal epithelium, which is continuous with the peritoneum of the mesovarium. So again, the ovary can be divided histologically into outer cortex and inner medulla region. Embedded in the highly vascularized connective tissue of the ovary cortex are many tiny sac-like structures called ovarian follicles, which are produced under the influence of FSH, that is follicle stimulating hormone, secreted by the anterior lobe of pituitary gland. And each follicle consists of an immature egg called an oocyte, encased by one or more layers of very different cells, and the surrounding cells are called the follicle cells. Fine. If a single layer is present, and granulosa cells when more than one layer is present. So follicles at different stages of maturation are distinguished by their structure. Fine. So in the cortex, a broad peripheral zone containing follicles, corpora lutea and interstitial endocrine cells are found, whereas in the medulla, connective tissue, blood vessels, lymph vessels and rete ovary are found. And this rete ovary is a narrow hilus at which nerves and vessels enter the ovary. So the histological details of the ovary, you can have a look at this particular diagram. It's a diagrammatic representation of the histological structure of the ovary, where you can even see the size of the ovary mentioned to be the 3 into 1.5 into 1 centimeter, and its location is the lateral pelvic wall. Fine. So you can be seeing the parts of the diagram when I keep explaining to you about it. So the outermost covering is the germinal epithelium. It's also called as the visceral peritoneum. Then the next layer is the tunica albuginea. Then there is a capsule of dense fibrous connective tissue, it is actually. Then ovary itself comprising of the outer cortex region and the inner medulla region. You can see in the cortex a number of follicles, fine, in different stages of development, like the primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and the mature Graafian follicle. Then the medulla are also seen there, which is innermost, and also it contains of the loose connective tissue, then blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. The stroma, that is the connective tissue of the ovary, is clearly seen with the number of fusiform cells within them. So about each of these follicles I am going to explain in the future slides. Fine. So in the ovarian follicles, I told you the growth and development of the follicles is under the influence of the hormone FSH. Fine. So here embedded, I said embedded in the highly vascular connective tissue of the ovary cortex are many tiny sac-like structures which are called as ovarian follicles. Fine. Each follicle consists of immature egg called oocyte, and it is encased by one or more layers of very different cells. The surrounding cells are called follicle cells. If a single layer is present, and granulosa cells when more than one layer is present. Fine. So follicles at different stages of maturation are distinguished by their structures. For example, in a primordial follicle, one layer of squamous-like follicle cells surrounds the oocyte. Fine. So here in this particular slide, one can see the pre-antral phase and antral phase of the ovarian follicle growth and development. In the pre-antral phase, the formation and beginning of growth and activation of primordial follicles and growth of primary and secondary follicles is seen, while in the antral phase, the formation of tertiary follicle, which is filled with the liquor folliculi, the fluid which is present inside the antrum. The follicle growth continues through the phases of recruitment, selection, dominance, and pre-ovulatory stage of follicular waves. Then oogonia develops from a primordial germ cell and differentiates into an oocyte in the ovary. Primordial follicle has a single layer of flattened granulosa cells or squamous cells. I just mentioned about it. Then the primary follicle has two or more layers of cuboidal or columnar type of granulosa cells which enclose the oocyte. Fine. So the primary follicle has a single layer of cuboidal granulosa cells which can be seen in the particular diagram. That is the third diagram for the ovarian follicles. Then the secondary follicle. So this primary follicle will become a secondary follicle when fluid fill spaces between the granular cells and then coalesce to form a central fluid-filled cavity called an antrum. At its most mature stage, when it is called a vesicular or Graafian follicle, the follicle bulges from the surface of the ovary. Fine. Here, the secondary follicle has two or more layers of cuboidal granulosa cells and a small number of theca cells. All the pre-antral follicles have a primary oocyte that is diploid in number. Then the tertiary follicle has several granulosa cell layers, theca cells, and primary oocyte and is characterized by an antral cavity which contains follicular fluid. The pre-ovulatory, or also called as Graafian follicle, is the last stage, I just said, is the last stage of follicle development, and these follicles are larger, have more antral fluid, and may contain a secondary oocyte which has haploid number of chromosomes. Then follicular fluid is a plasma exudate conditioned by secretory products from the granulosa cells and oocyte. Fine. This much you have to remember about this particular. So this is the histological structure of the ovary, showing a number of follicles. Like for example, you can mention about the cortex region, which is seen as in the form of cortical stroma. There are primordial follicles which are very clearly seen. Then there are also primary follicles which are seen very well, as well as there are oocyte nucleus which is there, nucleus which is found very much there. Then there are also the stromal cells. So the second diagram will give you the follicle with the oocyte. So here is the oocyte, that is the egg nucleus is there, surrounded by means of a layer which is called as zona pellucida. Fine. This zona pellucida actually is a say it's a substance which is rich in glycoprotein, and it forms a thick homogeneous transparent membrane around the oocyte. So zona pellucida is also present, which surrounds the oocyte. Fine. This second diagram is just a part of the enlarged diagram of, I feel it is a tertiary follicle, and there is the next stage which is called as the mature follicle called Graafian follicle, which is going to be produced little later. And this is the section which is stained under hematoxylin and eosin differential staining. So here is yet another diagram of the ovarian follicle, which is roughly a spheroidal cellular aggregation that's found in the ovaries. They also consist of cells called as granulosa cells and theca of follicle. There is a structure you can see called cumulus oophorus, which is a cluster of cells called cumulus cells that surround the oocyte both in the ovarian follicle and also after ovulation. The cells called granulosa cells or follicular cells are cells that surround the oocyte within the follicle, and their numbers increase directly in response to heightened levels of circulating gonadotropins or decrease in response to testosterone. The theca of follicle, the granulosa cells as such, in turn are enclosed in a thin layer of extracellular matrix, the follicular basement membrane or basal lamina. Outside the basal lamina, the layers called theca interna and theca externa are found. Theca externa is a fibrous layer, whereas theca internal is highly vascular in nature. There is a horseshoe-shaped cavity which is seen, it's called as antrum, which is found surrounding the oocyte. All the labelings, you can just have a look at the region of externa, theca externa, theca interna with blood capillaries and also fusiform cells. Then follicular cells are so very clearly seen in this particular section of the part of Graafian follicle or mature ovarian follicle. Fine. The next slide will again give you the histological structure as well as the diagrammatic representation of the mature Graafian follicle, that is the ovarian follicle, which is the stage after the first meiotic division has completed but before ovulation. So the follicle is large fluid filled follicle, and it is ready to rupture and expel its secondary oocyte, which by a process which is known as ovulation. Ovulation is nothing but the process of expulsion of ova from the ovary. And the oocyte now is haploid cell. It's haploid, it means it has got haploid number of chromosomes. And the follicle is characterized by a large follicular antrum that makes up most of the follicle filled with fluid called liquor folliculi. The secondary oocyte, having undergone the first meiotic division, is located eccentrically, that is little away from the center. Fine, you can just have a look at the labelings when I just keep explaining to you about this diagram. Then the whole structure as such you can just keep describing. Then this oocyte as such is surrounded by means of a layer which is called a zona pellucida and a layer of several cells which are known as the corona radiata. When released from the Graafian follicle and into the oviduct, the ovum will consist of three structures, that is the oocyte, the zona pellucida and corona radiata. The second diagram also is the diagram of the Graafian follicle, which has almost moved towards the peripheral region of the ovarian cortex, and it is just ready to be ovulated. You can see in the first diagram there is a theca externa, under which there is a layer of theca interna, under which there is one more layer which is called as the membrana granulosa cell, which is made up of follicular cells. Then again there is an internal cavity like this fluid filled called antrum, which is there, which is almost like horseshoe shape they described it as, and there is a structure which is called as oocyte surrounded by means of zona pellucida, and there is a mound of cells or hill like cells which is that region which is called as cumulus oophorus, which is also seen clearly in this particular diagrams. So the next is the corpus luteum. Soon after the process of ovulation, the yellow body remaining is called as corpus luteum. It produces actually hormones like progesterone, estrogen, relaxin and inhibin until it degenerates into fibrous scar tissue called corpus albicans, which is called white body. Fine. So this is again yet another view of the cortical region of the ovary, showing the presence of corpus luteum. So this corpus luteum as such is again formed under the influence of a hormone which is called as LH, luteinizing hormone. Fine. This corpus luteum is made up of lutein cells. In Latin, the word luteus means saffron, that is yellow. It develops immediately following ovulation. So when yellow pigment and lipids accumulate within the granulosa cells lining the follicle, especially the size of the corpus luteum is highly variable. So the corpus luteum is made up of lutein cells and they develop immediately following ovulation when yellow pigment and lipids accumulate within the granulosa cells lining the follicle. The corpus luteum is the endocrine remains of the collapsed follicle. That is, collapsed follicle is the Graafian follicle after the process of ovulation, after the expulsion of the ovum. And the center contains the remains of the blood clot that forms after ovulation. It's surrounding the clot are cells called as granulosa lutein cells, and on the outside theca lutein cells are found. So this slide here will give you yet another diagrammatic representation of the histological details of the ovary. You can see the cuboidal germinal epithelial cells almost covering the ovary. Then the division of the ovary into the outer cortex and the inner medulla region is clearly seen. Then you can even find the different stages of development of the ovarian follicle, starting from the oocyte itself, the primary follicle, secondary follicle, then tertiary follicles. There are also structures like the formation of antrum is seen in the third diagram within the cortexal region. Then there is a formation of Graafian follicle, which shows the presence of again the oocyte surrounded by means of zona pellucida, which at another surrounded by another layer which is called as zona or corona radiata. Further, it is surrounded by means of antrum, a cavity, and outside which there is the membrana granulosa layers formed of follicular cells, and finally the two theca coverings, which are called as the theca externa and the theca interna, can be seen within the Graafian follicle surrounding them. Fine. The other structure which is shown here is the process of ovulation, which has occurred when the ova gets expelled from the Graafian follicle. The oocyte surrounded by the zona pellucida and corona radiata also accompanies the egg. Fine. So once this is done, suppose if there is fertilization, what happens? The complete structure will turn into sorry, I was just describing to you about the process of ovulation. Once that is done, the remaining structure after the expulsion of the ova will turn into the structure which is called as corpus luteum, which is also an endocrine organ within the cortical region of the ovary itself, and it secretes a hormone called as progesterone. Especially when there is the process of fertilization occurring, what happens to this corpus luteum? It will exist for almost 4 to 5 months. Otherwise, if there is no fertilization, its life span will be just 5 to 6 weeks. That's all. And it will not secrete the progesterone further. Then after that, if this particular structure becomes little hard and it turns into another structure which is called as the corpus albicans. Corpus albicans is also seen as the last rounded structure in the lower side of this ovarian region. And right in the center one can find the mesovarium, the other side, and the entry of the connective tissue, stromal cells. Along with that, there are cells which form the interstitial cells. Then also you can find number of blood capillaries, then lymphatics, etc., which are seen in the center of this zone. So I think with this I should stop with the lecture. Then these are few references. You can just have a look at these references, go through them and try to understand the subject much better. Thank you, girls.